Thank you. Good evening and welcome to Scholars Strike for Liberation panel, Venezuela, the Caribbean to Iran, Capitalism, Imperialism, Sanctions and Protests. My name is Beverly Bain of Scholars Strike for Liberation. I also teach in Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Toronto, here in Canada. Since this programming is coming to you from Toronto, I'll begin with a land acknowledgement from where I sit. We are broadcasting from the traditional ancestral territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. This territory is covered by Treaty 13, the Williams Treaties, and the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. We must note that the Canadian state has never upheld their obligations under these treaties. The very inception of Canada has been marked by the violent dispossession of Indigenous peoples and the brutal enslavement of African peoples. This colonial violence and settler colonial violence is ongoing to this day. We are gathering here today as part of our obligation to take care of each other, the land, and the creatures we share it with. On the 3rd of January 2026, in the middle of the night, the US kidnapped President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, from their compound. This followed months of planning and extrajudicial killings of Fisher people from Trinidad and Tobago and Venezuela. The Trump regime, with support from the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, installed technological surveillance equipment at the Tobago airport while requiring other Caribbean countries to adhere to specific demands, such as acting as third countries for deportees from the US. The Trump administration, while exerting its imperialist agenda in Iran through bombings and sanctions, has further exacerbated the brutality and killing of Iranians by the Iran authoritarian theocratic regime. To date, over 36,000 Iranians have been killed by the Iranian regime. Trump's current attempt at the creation of a new global order where macro-imperialism, oil, sanctions, and hybrid warfare are being used to promote US imperialist agendas is being met with fierce resistance by activists on the ground in Iran, in Venezuela, and in the Caribbean. This evening, the panel brings together scholars and activists to discuss the current global context and the connections in Trump's imperialist war on Venezuela, the Caribbean, and what's happening in Iran. I will provide brief introductions of all panelists. Of course, this does not in any way reflect the extensive experience and work that these panelists have been doing for decades. I will ask each of them to speak for 10 minutes and to do that in the order of their introduction. Starting with Tamanisha John. Tamanisha is an assistant professor of Black politics in the Department of Politics at York University. She is a member of the Black Alliance for Peace and the Caribbean Solidarity Network. David Abdulah is a Trinidad and Tobago trade unionist, economist, and politician. He served as the General Secretary of the Oilfield Workers Trade Union and is the current leader of the Movement for Social Justice. Cira Pascual Marquina of La Red Internacional de Democracia Comunal Venezuela is a political science professor at the Universidad Bolivariana de Venezuela in Caracas. She's also co-producer and co-host with Chris Gilbert of the Marxist education program Escuela de Cuatros. She's actively engaged with grassroots organizations in Venezuela. Shahzard Mojab is a revolutionary Marxist Feminist internationalist. She is also Professor Emerita of Education and Women and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto. Welcome to our 4 esteemed guests, and I will ask Tamanisha to begin. Thank you.
So first, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. And I do know that our remarks to open should be about 10 minutes. And so I was asked to give some insight into US capitalism and imperialism in the Caribbean region. And so I think it's important to start off by noting that US imperialist and capitalist expansion in the Caribbean began in the 19th century. So, you know, around like the late 1890s and into the early 1900s and all the way until the present. And the reason why I think it's important to highlight that it began in the 19th century, um, particularly in late 1899, and then forward from that point, is because the first sort of US capitalist and hence expansionists in the Caribbean region were comprised of a class of financiers who were bankers, who were, industrial families, settler families in the United States. And so US expansion into the Caribbean initially started off prioritizing US capitalist, financial, and industrial interests over any sort of socioeconomic well-being for the people. This made it so that by the time that the US first occupation of Haiti started in 1915, that occupation was for the pure or sole purpose of securing US financial interests in Haiti as it had been doing by that point in the rest of the Caribbean. And so whereas a lot of people recognize that the first US occupation of Haiti came with them imposing sort of military dictatorship, looting Haitian resources, etc., a large part of that looting of the resources to maintain US financial interests also included relegating Haitians into forced laborers uh, in their sort of free, independent country at that time. And I think that this is very informative when we think about how the US continues to engage in the Caribbean in the present. So the US still has a vested interest in depressing wages in Haiti. The US still intervenes in states in the region to protect their own sort of financial interests. And the US also disregards local sovereignty or sovereignties that exist in the Caribbean. And so when we think about sort of the history of US capitalist and imperialist expansion in the region, it has always been extractive in nature to secure its own interests. And throughout history, of course, there are movements and different pushes to get not just the US, but other types of Western and European capital out of these countries so that the people can assert deeper rights to self-determination and sovereignty. And then the pushback against the assertion of those rights are always quite fierce. Something else to note in sort of the history of US capitalism and imperialism in the region is that it does not act alone, whereas the US has this sort of financial push in the Caribbean region. You also have the Canadians, which stayed a part of the sort of British imperialist trading architecture for a much longer time. And so they've had their sort of very successful financiers in the region. We still see the hallmarks of that when our main banks are like Scotiabank, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, Royal Bank of Canada, First Caribbean, or uh, all of those banks are Canadian. And what happened is that there's then a sort of alliance between the sort of Canadian financiers and the Western corporations and businesses that they're able to extend credits to. They're not necessarily there to sort of enrich or help develop those countries. And so the Caribbean, as a sort of site of capitalist exploitation, once the US enters the picture as the United, States in the 19th century, uh, is a sort of exploited zone whose, sovereignty and local practices are always intervened in by the United States if they steer too far from the path of protecting and maintaining US and Western capitalist interest. And if we want to shine a light on Haiti, I would say that while many states in the Caribbean, with the exception of Cuba, is engaged in a socialist project, the other states would define themselves as these sort of capitalist democracies. And Haiti stands out as an exception to that because unlike the other states whose governments sort of consent to this system of underdevelopment, for the minor privileges that they get being political bureaucrats within the Western imperialist system, Haiti has been under formal UN trusteeship for about 22 years now, ever since the 2004 coup in Haiti. And under this sort of UN trusteeship, that trustee group, or the group that, is given tutelage over Haiti, consists of the United States, Canada, France, the European Union, Brazil, and Colombia. And I think that this is very important to note because anytime people talk about the lack of development or underdevelopment or corruption in Haiti, and they try to blame it on these Haitian politicians, Haitians have not had politicians elected by or for the Haitian people in over 2 decades. And so what we are really commenting on is the fact that UN trusteeship has created a sort of crisis in Haiti. And the crisis is manufactured so that Haitians would lose more of their land to US and Canadian mining corporations, so that Haitians continue to be low-wage manufacturers for the Western Hemisphere in general, not just for North America, but we also see increasingly for the Latin American states as well. And then, of course, all of that comes with the xenophobic logics against Haitian migration, not just in the Caribbean and Latin America, but also in the North American countries as well. And so uh, there are levels to the amount of exploitation that occurs in the Caribbean region, and they do look different from, exploiting Cuba through sanctions and blockades, to exploiting Haiti through UN trusteeship, and through exploiting a lot of the other countries through territorial status and or through capitalist democratic governance that effectively surrenders any sort of development objective to the whims and geopolitical interests and mandates of the United States. And I will stop there because I think I've spoken for 10 minutes, but I think that that could guide sort of tonight's discussion.
Sorry. Thank you, Tamanisha. Appreciate it. David?
Right. Well, thank you very much, Beverly, for inviting me to be part of this discussion, and greetings to all who are tuned in. And just one slight correction. I consider myself as a retired trade unionist because it's been almost 10 years now since I retired from the Office Workers Trade Union. But I did spend all of my official working life, 39 years, with the union in various positions. So I suppose I'm still seen by many as a labor or trade union activist or leader, although I'm not.
Trade unionist.
Yes, I'm not active. I keep connected with, but I'm not active in the unions again. So let me look at some of the current situations with respect to this very important topic of capitalism, imperialism, sanctions, and protests. And to begin by saying that neoliberal capitalism is and has been for quite some time in serious crisis, manifesting a number of different ways. There is, of course, rapidly growing inequality between countries, and inequality within countries. The old saying that the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer is very, very true. And we know all of the information about the world's richest billionaires and how much more their wealth has increased in the last few years, and comparing their wealth to the poorest 40–50% of the world's population, and so on. So all that data is out there. I need not emphasize that. But that growing inequality creates, of course, a social crisis, which is manifest in various ways. People are no longer in permanent employment, so they have insecure jobs, insecure livelihoods, and therefore their life and their sense of the future is very uncertain. And of course, that generates all kinds of other issues. So it leads to the rise of right-wing populism and neo-fascism, which then identifies the other as the enemy of those who have lost what they had or what they thought they had in terms of a secure future, secure jobs, and so on. And therefore you get xenophobia, the rise of xenophobia, the whole anti-immigrant sentiments and the like. So that's one social manifestation. But young people are particularly affected by this crisis of neoliberal capitalism because so many young people are unemployed, including those who have tertiary education. A second very important manifestation of this crisis is very specific to the United States, because the US, of course, has and continues to run huge fiscal deficits. Their expenditure versus their income as a government don't match. Expenditure way exceeds income, partly as a result of neoliberal policies of reducing taxation on the wealthy, and therefore and a huge expenditure on their military. And those two factors in particular have resulted in a huge and growing deficit and therefore debt. And of course, they also run a huge deficit on their trade account. In other words, they're importing far more than they are exporting. And this was also as a result of the neoliberal globalization model, where US corporations, transnational companies, US capital, located manufacturing and other centers of economic activity in the value chain outside of the United States, and therefore were increasing the level of imports. So in that context, the US has only been able to sustain those deficits, both the fiscal deficit and the trade deficit, by way of the fact that it is the world's reserve currency, and therefore capital flows go into the United States by way of countries holding and individuals and corporations owning bonds and shares in the United States, and that transfer of capital therefore helps the US to maintain these huge deficits. Any other country that had those deficits would be under a very severe IMF program and engage in massive austerity. But the US gets away with that. But that is not sustainable. The third thing that I want to refer to is the loss of US hegemony, in particular with the rise of China. China, in terms of its technological development, is many people assess as being ahead of the United States technologically, and in many other ways, China, in terms of the rapid economic growth and even in terms of its military capacity, is now challenging US hegemony, but particularly in the area of the economy and in the area of its technological capacity and development. And of course, China hasn't fought any wars. Its expenditure on its military is much less than the United States. And so it was able to invest in what was known as the Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure projects in many parts of the world, which opened up markets for Chinese goods in other countries, and also gave China a certain amount of access to natural resources outside of its national territorial boundaries. So US hegemony is being challenged. You have as well the rise of the BRICS, which of course is still a process underway, but not only BRICS, but other kinds of trading agreements and so on, and economic arrangements, which are in the direction of weakening or breaking US economic hegemony. And so we see what some have now called the development of a multipolar world. In this context, therefore, for the United States, for US imperialism to maintain its position, it has to acquire resources, access to markets. And the only way it can do so is by this return, if you wish, to naked gunboat diplomacy, to the naked use of force, this threat of sanctions or the use of sanctions and so on, regime change in a very aggressive manner, and to control resources and or markets, and of course access to cheap labor and so on, as Tamanisha mentioned. And so this is what we are seeing unfolding, and Trump has been articulating this agenda explicitly, the national security strategy of the United States is very, very explicit that the Western Hemisphere will only be the preserve of the United States, of US imperialism. Therefore, Monroe Doctrine on steroids, what Trump boasts about and now calls the Monroe Doctrine. And therefore, whether it is Greenland or whether it is Venezuela or Cuba or anywhere else, must all now be subjected to total US control. And they will do that by any means necessary. And they manifested that in their bombing on January 3rd of Venezuela and the kidnapping of President Maduro and the first combatant Celia Flores, and the threats now to do so against Colombia. Cuba in particular is in Marco Rubio's sights for another reason, because Rubio has this burning agenda and ambition to be the one to destroy the Cuban Revolution. He coming out of that right-wing community in Miami of Cuban Americans. What we also see is the breakup of, therefore, the post-World War II settlements of the so-called rules-based order of the United Nations, of respect for sovereignty of other countries. Not that that was ever respected, as Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, said recently, but they gave the impression that this was what was supposed to take place. And for us in the Caribbean in particular, the weakening and in fact great division in CARICOM is one of the outcomes of this agenda, as some countries like Trinidad and Tobago, which government has clearly been a lackey of Washington insofar as the military deployment and aggression in the Southern Caribbean and the attack on Venezuela is concerned. And therefore that has implications for whatever limited sovereignty we may have in this context being further reduced in this period of Trump and this very aggressive US imperialism. And I'll end there.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. Cira?
So thank you, Beverly, and to everybody who's made this possible. I am, as you said, a professor and a political educator, but I want to make this this brief intervention basically on the base of what it means to live, like in your own body, very near you, U.S. military aggression, a U.S. military attack, and the kidnapping of our president and Celia Flores. Before that, Beverly, because sometimes I'm bad with keeping track of time. If I'm going on very long, maybe you can wave your hand or something like that so that I will round up.
I don't mind if you go over a couple minutes. That's okay.
Well, in any case, just let me know, and thanks.
Okay. Yeah.
So, because we are talking about U.S. imperialism, and of course, U.S. imperialism for all of us, it is nothing new. Venezuela has been basically under siege for the last 26 years, and especially we could say since 2002, when there was a coup against President Hugo Chavez, that was actually pretty overtly supported by the U.S. and actually by the Spanish state as well. But specifically, we are talking here about U.S. imperialism, so it's important to center that what we are living right now is actually, of course, an intensification of the war of U.S. imperialism against the sovereign project, against a project that struggles to build a sovereign and socialist future via the communes. But if we go back to 2002, we see the coup. There's been different paramilitary attempts to overthrow the government, coup attempts, fascist appraisals in 2014 and 2016, which we called guarimbas here in Venezuela. There's also been, of course, a very long, not as long as the sanctions on Cuba, not as long as the sanctions on Iran, but we've had a very long process of sanctions being imposed on the people of Venezuela, and sanctions are really a war without bombs. About at least 40,000 people had died by 2019 due to the US blockade on the people of Venezuela. Actually, there is an important Lancet report that adds up the deaths around the world due to sanctions, to US sanctions, and it goes well over 500,000 people dead every year by US sanctions. And this is, as I was saying before, wars without bombs that kill people just the same, kill young people, kill especially, of course, young and poor people. And they are a very violent way of attempting to impose the will of this hegemonic force, this hegemonic imperialism that is actually losing ground. As David was saying, one of the reasons why we are seeing this we could say increased violence, at least in our continent. Of course, that's not the same in West Asia, where the violence against the people of Palestine and, of course, Iran and Lebanon has been ongoing for a long time. But the violence that we have witnessed, which has intensified, we could say specifically since January 3rd, this violence is something that is actually a little bit new or anew for the people of Latin America and the Caribbean. In 1989, there was, of course, the invasion of Panama, but since then we have not seen such overt violence. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how January 3rd felt for me and for other comrades and sisters and brothers who lived it here. Because I was an anti-imperialist before this, and I am an anti-capitalist, and I was an anti-imperialist before this. But it is one thing to understand it and also to see people around you and yourself suffer, and specifically due to the sanctions. But it is another thing to see the city being bombed and to see your president, your elected president, and a National Assembly deputy being kidnapped outside of all international law and in absolute disrespect for sovereignty. That day and the days that have followed, that day specifically was extremely difficult, and I can say that the people of Venezuela were and continue to be very angry. Of course, the buildup had been happening since August, and basically the Trump administration had been announcing that this was going to happen, but we didn't know in what shape, way, or form it would take place. When the U.S. bombs your city, and I actually wasn't so close to the actual bombing sites, but the windows in my apartment were rattling, and I could actually see a little bit of the shine of the bombs, even though also where I'm living from doesn't actually look in the direction of the sites that were bombed. When you feel that on your body, that's a different moment of encounter with the violence and apparent irrationality of US imperialism. But I want to say that the apparent irrationality of US imperialism, be it here in Venezuela or in Gaza, hand on hand with Zionism, the apparent irrationality actually responds to a logic, to a rationality of needing to maintain its hegemony around the world. Indeed, as also going back to what David was saying, the US has been losing hegemony. And the reason why we saw this violence exercised on the 3rd, this intensified violence exercised on the 3rd against the people of Venezuela, is actually written up in a document that was mentioned before too, which is the national security document. It is an overt intention of the US to reclaim control over the hemisphere. It is actually a recognition of losing of ground to China and Russia, but specifically to China. And this means that that the forms of war that were exported further from our hemisphere, in the say last 20 to 30 years are coming back home. This is not only an attack against Venezuela, this is also an attack against the people of Latin America and the Caribbean, and it is an exemplary punishment for the people of Venezuela. An exemplary punishment so that, for instance, Colombia or Brazil or Mexico, countries with progressive governments, will not dare to try to build truly sovereign projects, because you know what's coming if that happens. These days, however, while we are full of anger and while these have not been, it's almost 3 weeks, while these have not been easy days at all, they have actually been demoralizing days to a certain degree, and this may sound surprising to you folks, but the truth is that right after the bombing, the government and the high military command and the people have shown a great degree of unity. And this is very, very important in the face of an imperialist, of any attack, but specifically an imperialist attack. There is no doubt that the US, the Trump administration, wanted to see what would follow the attack on the 3rd as a situation of chaos in the Venezuelan territory, in Venezuela. And what we saw was absolutely the opposite. Unity, hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets in support of Delcy Rodriguez as the person who's assuming as acting president, demanding the return of President Maduro and Cilia Flores, and of course, mourning our dead. Because one thing that is often not told is that while this attack represents a tremendous military technological superiority on the part of US imperialism, the people of Venezuela and also Cuban internationalists fought to defend the president and to defend the homeland. More than 100 people were killed in approximately 1 hour. But what have we seen in the following days? Hundreds of thousands of people marching basically every day, demanding the return of our president, because he's our president, because we chose him as our president, in support of the government, in support of the Bolivarian Revolution, and of course, in absolute rejection of the violence of US imperialism as it tries to impose its dictates on the people of Venezuela and break away with the sovereignty that these people, that this pueblo has built over the last 3 decades, but actually, like any people of the world who have been submitted to colonialism and neocolonialism, the fight and the struggle is a long and ongoing struggle. What we saw in the following days was a tremendous amount of unity. So if one of the objectives of US imperialism of the Trump administration was to generate chaos, which I'm sure it was, they did not succeed at that. They did not succeed at generating chaos, and actually what they have succeeded at generating is a sense of unity. And I want to say one more thing. This is a country with a majority that is Chavista, but it's a country where there is also an opposition to the government. And I have not heard, I promise, I swear, that I have not heard one single person in the street, in the metro, in the hallways, in the wherever of Caracas celebrating the attack. There is a collective sense of rejection, and as I was saying before, anger. That is not what is told by the mainstream media, which is one of the apparatus of US imperialism. The mainstream media will show you people in Miami, in Coraldale, something like that. That's where they live. That's where the Venezuelan bourgeoisie, which opted to leave Venezuela, lives. And they celebrated. But here in Venezuela, there was absolutely no celebration of the attack. And why? Well, I think it's at one level it's obvious why no people like to be bombed by a foreign power. But then the force that we have seen in the streets, which, just hours after the attack, brought out hundreds of thousands of people to march in Caracas. Why do we see that? You might say, well, you've been attacked. The normal thing, the predictable thing rather, the predictable thing would be that, people would retreat to their homes for a period of time and see what is going on, try to understand the situation. But very, very quickly, we saw people pouring into the streets to defend the government and to demand the return of our president. Why is that? I want to highlight here, and make me a sign again when I'm talking too long, but I want to emphasize that the Bolivarian Revolution, contrary to what the accounts are on the mainstream media, and of course of politicians in the US, be they Democrats or Republicans, uh, what is represented as an authoritarian regime is actually a profoundly democratic project of collective emancipation. In Venezuela, we have two spheres of democracy. We could say that we have one sphere of conventional liberal democracy, a Western form of democracy where we choose the president and the National Assembly, representatives or parliamentarians, we could say, and the majors and so on and so forth. Like the conventional structures. And these conventional, let's say, this conventional sphere of democracy is part of a conventional state, which has, it has judicial power and legislative power and executive power, and we also have an electoral power, and we could, I don't know how you say that, kind of like an overseeing power. So we have five powers. But basically, this is a pretty conventional sphere of democracy and of the organization of the state. But what is and this is, like as well working or better working than most Western democracies, in the sense that here we don't have to choose between, like conservative and a right wing and a centrist option, a right wing and a centrist right wing option, which is what most of the West faces. But actually, we have also a party that is a socialist party and that aims to transform. But anyway, this is we could say, the relatively conventional sphere of democracy. But then Venezuela has another sphere of democracy. And that's what gives so much power and so much impetus to the people to come out to the streets immediately after the attack on Venezuela. And that's communal democracy, or direct and participative democracy. Since the very beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution, there's been a stated objective to widen the scope of democracy to a kind of democracy that will actually bring the voices of people, where you will not only choose who's your representative every 2, 4, or 6 years, but actually a new form of democracy that is a grassroots democracy, where people at in their barrios, in their neighborhoods, in the countryside, wherever they live, they are able to organize in assemblies, in communes, what we call communes, which, mind you, should not be confused with the communes of the 60s or 70s, the hippie communes, which also had emancipatory objectives, but were isolated initiatives. The communes are not isolated initiatives; they are actually part of a national project of collective emancipation. But communes are structured as territories where, for instance, in my commune, El Pal commune, 10,000 people live there, and we meet in assemblies to decide what our problems are and how we are going to solve it. And this is what we call participative direct democracy. But there's also another sphere, which is that, as probably everybody knows, Venezuela since 2006 proposes to build a socialist future. And a socialist future is not just built with assemblies. It actually comes with the reorganization of the economical life of the country. And that's where communes have another important element, because communes ought to have, not all communes, there's about 4,000 to 5,000 communes in Venezuela, and communes ought to have, but the truth is that not all of them have them yet, means of production. Means of production where what is produced not with the goal of accumulating capital, but with the goal of producing goods for society and for the commune. And the surplus that is produced in those means of production goes back to the commune, goes back to everybody. It doesn't go back to the workers, directly to the workers, who are, of course, who have their remuneration. It's not a cooperative, it's not a state property, it's of course not bourgeois private property, but it is communal property. The surplus of what is produced in my commune's means of production, which is actually in this case a textile making plant, a meat packing plant, and a soap making plant, the surplus of that goes back to the commune. And so we can say that Venezuela not only has this conventional democracy, but has a substantive democracy, a democracy that really goes to transforming, as people desire, the whole we could say political and economic structures of our society. The economic, the social forms of reproduction, of production and reproduction of life are reorganized via the commune. So, and I will close here. I think it's important to understand that if we saw hundreds of thousands, if we have seen hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets of Caracas immediately after an imperialist attack that killed many people and that kidnapped our president, it's precisely because the people of Venezuela do not assume themselves as victims, but as subjects of transformation. And we assume ourselves as subjects of transformation, not just because there's a discourse around it, but because there's a space, the commune, where you can actually directly participate and begin to transform the world in which you live. And these communes are extraordinary exercises in direct substantive democracy, but they happen hand in hand with the government, which supports them. So the government supports the communes support the government. That's why we have seen such a robust outpouring of people into the streets of Caracas. Keep an eye on what the government of the Bolivarian Revolution is saying in these times, because all sorts of lies all sorts of fakes are being built up in the US imperialist media. So keep an ear open for what the people of Venezuela are saying. Keep an ear open for the pictures and the videos of hundreds of thousands of people in the streets supporting the government. And I think that that is the best way of really understanding what is going on. Imperialism gave us a blow. It was a tactical victory for imperialism, but we are sure that strategic victory will be ours, because there is an extraordinary project here, which is called the communes, that really opens the windows and the doors to a new world, to a profoundly democratic world.
Thank you, Cira. Thank you very much. I'll now turn to Shahzad.
Thank you, Beverly, and thank you all my comrades and colleagues on this panel, as well as all the participants. To maintain coherence while I'm grappling with the grief of the death, as Beverly, you mentioned, more than 35,000 Iranians during the last few days, I have prepared some notes. And what I address here is complex and multi-layered. And these notes are intended as an opening, with much remain to be examined and unraveled, especially listening to other panelists here. The region currently referred to as the Middle East is literally engulfed in deep crisis, politically, socially, culturally, and economically. What we are witnessing is the systematic destruction of life, massacre, genocide, annihilation, displacement, and forced exodus. People from Palestine, Afghanistan, Iran, Rojava, the Kurdish region in Syria, and Turkey are driven from their homes, pushed toward closed borders and uncertain futures, denied security, dignity, and hope. So in this brief talk, I don't intend to catalog every atrocity or enumerate every shattered life, but rather to explore with you the global structural brutality that underpins and connects this widespread violence. I want to underscore the urgency of understanding the workings of capitalist fascist imperialism. All the panelists have been alluding to this. So the mechanism, by which I mean the mechanisms that creates conflicts that are generated, maintained, and globally circulated. And I think that such understanding is essential if we are to confront, undo, and reconstitute the discourses and political actions that normalize its violence. So if we take only the first few weeks of the year 2026 as a point of reference, you've already heard about what is going on in Venezuela and Caribbeans. And if we add to all of this the ongoing war in Sudan, Yemen, Libya, the mass uprising in Iran, the emergence of ISIS in Syria, alongside the genocidal campaign against the Kurdish population in Rojava, and the ongoing genocide of Palestine, we shouldn't forget that hasn't stopped as yet by the settler colonial state of Israel. The death of migrants even at the hands of ICE and militarized borders are certainly more that we can sort of itemize here. We should pause and ask this question. What world order makes this level of disregard for human life, for their hopes and aspirations possible? How do we articulate our outrage, our frustration, and our anger? How do we think seriously about possibilities of radical revolutionary resistance? People are taking to the streets, crossing borders, climbing mountains, persisting within refugee camps and across transnational regimes of displacement, and resisting even in the ruins of Gaza. So let's consider right now the announcement of the so-called Board of Peace for Gaza, led by President Trump. This imperialist fascist initiative is not a peace plan, but a strategy designed to entrench occupation, sustain domination, and facilitate the continued extractions of resources from the Palestinian people and also with extension to the rest of the region. We can return to a fuller discussion of this plan later. For now, suffice to note that the Palestinian BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions National Committee, the largest coalition of Palestinian civil society organizations, has condemned and rejected this plan. They identified the plan as an attempt to normalize Israel's ongoing genocide, among other things. So, again, the question before us is not only what is happening, but where are we in relations to all these struggles? And by we, I mean the left. And by that, I mean the solidarity. Where is our anti-imperialist, radical, revolutionary, feminist, and anti-fascist front? How do we build it collectively, urgently, and without abstraction? And by without abstraction, I mean by anchoring analysis in historical specificity, material relations, and ongoing struggles. Now, Iran is a case in point. We talked about the massive death in a span of few days. The current protests are neither an imminent revolutionary rupture nor simply the product of foreign interference. but the outcome of a conjunctural crisis in protracted degradation of everyday life, acute crisis of economic redistribution, converge with a regime that has lost its legitimacy. Iran is one of the most studied yet least understood political formation of the late 20th century, particularly due to the contradictory assessments of the 1979 revolution. That revolution initially inspired to democracy, secular governance, and the dismantling of monarchical despotism. Yet it was ultimately captured by the Islamist forces. The struggle for power among nationalists, secularists, Islamists, and the left, either socialists or communists, began almost immediately and took concrete form through the first state assaults on women's freedom, most notably the imposition of compulsory veiling and the armed attack on the autonomous Kurdish movement. This gendered and nationality-based state violence was never erased from the collective consciousness of the people. It resurfaced, in fact, powerfully after the death of Jina Amini in 2022, a Kurdish woman brutally killed in police custody for allegedly wearing quote-unquote improper veiling, and the movement awakened the very important and powerful slogan of women, life, freedom. The first decade of the Islamic Republic was marked by relentless violence and mass killing, culminating in episodes such as the execution of approximately 5,000 political prisoners within a span of just 2 months. I could continue enumerating atrocities. However, my point is twofold. First, popular resistance in Iran has persisted over 4 decades. Iran has experienced more protests and acts of civil dissident per year than nearly any other country. Second, and most crucially, the formation of the Islamic Republic occurred within a specific global conjuncture. The rise of capitalist neoliberalism and a profound theoretical and political shift that shaped both international power relations and the internal consolidation of authoritarian theocratic rule. The Iranian people are not only subjected to domestic authoritarianism, they are also positioned as casualties of inter-imperialist struggles over the reconfiguration of the global order. The recent wave of uprising must therefore be understood not simply as an internal crisis of the Islamic Republic, but as an expression of intensifying antagonisms among rival imperialist blocs. During the most recent uprising, competing imperial powers sought to instrumentalize popular unrest in divergent and contradictory ways. On the one hand, the long-standing interventionist strategies of the United States and Israel, operating through intelligence, media, and proxy networks, work to redirect mass dissent into forms of escalation that risked militarization and mass bloodshed. Such dynamics served less to advance emancipatory outcomes than to weaken Iran as a regional competitor and to reassert US leverage amid growing challenges from China and Russia in the Middle East. On the other hand, the Islamic Republic's capacity to carry out sustained, larger-scale repression cannot be separated from its integration into an imperialist alignment. The political, military, and logistical backing provided by China and Russia has been indispensable to the regime's ability to maintain internal control under the conditions of sanctions, economic crisis, and popular revolt. The regime's coercive capacity is entangled with external powers through technologies of surveillance, security operation, arms transfer, and information operation. Meanwhile, rival powers instrumentalize unrest and mirror these logics by escalating cyber war, targeted killings, propaganda, and proxy warfare. The outcome is deadly combination of imperialist competition and domestic authoritarianism that co-produce a carceral order not only in Iran, but throughout the region. My analysis also refuses the mythology of that it is called axis of anti-imperialism. And here is the relationship between Iran and Venezuela. The substitution of one authoritarian bloc for another is not emancipation. It is the reorganization of domination under new configuration and political complicity with authoritarian, patriarchal, and carceral states, so long as they position themselves rhetorically against only the US imperialism. It's what has been sort of accepted. The elevation of the Islamic State to the status of an inherently quote-unquote anti-imperialist force function as ideological cover for a regime that it is deeply embedded in capitalist accumulation, border regimes, militarized extraction, and the violent suppression of its population. From the earliest days of this recent uprising, the Israeli settler colonial state intervened rhetorically, claiming alignment with the Iranian people. This gesture was an extension of its strategic alignment with the US imperialism and its regional war apparatus. Such interventions functioned as political weapons. They supplied the Islamic State with additional pretexts to escalate repression, securitize dissidents, and criminalize popular struggle under the banner of foreign conspiracy. Now, it is in this poisoned political train that also we have another element, and that is the crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, the son of the deposed Shah, who was deposed by the 1979 revolution, that now sort of is becoming or framed and reconstituted as a political asset, operating as a sort of a ally of the US capitalist imperialist plan through reckless exaggeration and fabricated timelines of an imminent quote-unquote end of the regime. Pahlavi sought to capture popular dispersion and redirect it toward a reactionary restoration project. And the emergence of this combination, which is the monarchist, Zionist, fascist current organized around this, the figure of Pahlavi, must be confronted as an immediate and material threat. Its ideological grammar and organizational form are openly modeled on MAGA, the MAGA movement in the United States, and for Iran is MIGA, Make Iran Great Again. The current is not, this current is not opposition force, but a patriarchal comprador formation, a broker of sanctions warfare, military escalation, and geopolitical bargaining constructed over the bodies and lives of the population. Its function is not liberation, but containment, challenging revolt away from structural transformation and toward capitalist imperialist management authoritarian restoration, and permanent war. Let me just end by quoting something from a very important writing, and I'll be happy to share the link with the participants here. And that is the title of this piece is "In Pursuit of Whiteness: Why Iranian Monarchists Cheer Israel's Genocide." And here is the quote: "The struggles across our region are inseparable. Palestinian liberation from genocide connects to Iranian liberation from sanctions and military attacks, and Syrian, Yemenite, and Sudanese liberation from colonial wars, aerial bombing, and proxy conflict, all emerge from the same imperial logic, treating our lives as inexpendable. When we stand with Palestinian resistance, we challenge Western domination over our entire region. When we cheer their destruction, we strengthen the forces oppressing us all. The Palestinian flag represents our common struggle for dignity and sovereignty. We are attacked as one people. Therefore, we must respond as one people. Rarely in history has a rallying cry connected local, regional, and universal experiences of oppression with such clarity. From indigenous lands to sanctioned economies, from surveillance states to bombed cities, wherever the powerful crush the powerless, where colonial logic dehumanizes entire peoples, where resistance faces overwhelming force, one slogan unites our common struggles for dignity and sovereignty. And that is, I will add to it, that slogan: free Palestine, free Rojava, free Iran, and down, going back to the 1970s slogan, down with the US imperialism. Thank you.
Beverly, you're muted.
Thank you all. This was incredible, very generative conversation. And what is really clear from this conversation is the complexity of the global world that we live in. The conversation started with Tamanisha giving us a sense of expansion into the Caribbean by the US, and hearing also the way in which the Caribbean region has been a financialized region, Haiti and the rest of the Caribbean region, and one that has been imperialized and colonized. And we hear in terms of the fact that the US has never permitted countries of the Caribbean region to ever be self-determined, right? Not only was there an invasion in 1989 of Panama, but there was an invasion of Grenada in 1983. That actually, led, that really was purposeful, in destroying what could have been a revolution, a positive way of transformation for the people. The Caribbean islands, some of the Eastern Caribbean states were also very much involved in undermining what was happening in Grenada at the time, not just the US. Because another thing that gets very complicated is that, and we're witnessing now, and I'm thinking about what's happening in the Caribbean region now, where you have, like Trinidad and Tobago, for instance, that has agreed to support the US in, conducting its occupation and invasion, and using sort of Caribbean region as a way to launch its attack on Venezuela. So we're hearing how complex this is, but it's also historical, in terms of how the Caribbean region has been this site for US imperialism, but Canadian imperialism as well. We heard from, the Prime Minister Carney, recently about his concerned that he would be swallowed up by the bigger powers, and that the middle powers, which is Canada, should be caring for itself, not recognizing that Canada itself is an imperialist and settler colonial nation. And then hearing from, Cira about the kind of work and transformation that was taking place in Venezuela, but was undermined, again, historically and ongoing by the US, leading to the kidnapping of, Maduro and his wife, Cila, right? We see this historical repetition in some way, but also a new kind of global order expanding. But then we hear, in terms of Shahzad's piece, how complex it is in the region, in the Middle East region. There's not just one player. It's not just the US. There is Israel. There are also the United Arab Emirates, and then of course Iran as a nation, has with its theocratic and repressive government, has also there are people on the ground who have constantly pushed back against this regime. But within that protest that we are witnessing here, and within the pushback, there are also elements that are very, that are very capitalist and very imperialist, right? So we see all of these forces that are playing out in this complex world. It is not as simple as we would like the conversation to be. It's a very complex conversation, and various regions have various actors. But we see that there is definitely a shift in the global order to one that is defined by a capitalist, imperialist, very, I would say, very undemocratic, very repressive context that we are witnessing, that countries are being forced to be compelled into that kind of dynamic. So I want to actually then throw out the question. I want to go back to a question that Shahzad threw out, and I want to hear, and other people are open to responding. If there are things that have been said by other people that you want to pick up on, please do let me know. But I think the question is, in terms of how do we actually start thinking about an anti-imperialist world? I mean, people have died. We have lost so many people to fighting imperialism, capitalism, neoliberalism. We have lost so many people, right? So the question becomes, how do we create an anti-imperialist world? How do we work towards, pushing back against this particular kind of new world order that we are experiencing right now? Because it almost seems as if the US, other global powers, and I would say the UAE, I would say Saudi Arabia, I would say, even China and Russia in their own ways. I mean, there is a coalescing in a particular way of superpowers against those of us who are seen as the ones in the South, where there's a juggling for control. And the question becomes, we who are, the people in the South, those of us on the ground, those of us who wants to create a world that's just, that's liberated, that's a world that service, and in service of the people, in service of freedom and liberation. How do we do that in the context of the world that we're witnessing right now? So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to leave it to people to respond and to take up little pieces, any pieces that you feel that was left out, that you would like to take up as well. So I saw, Tamanisha, did you have your hand up?
Yes, and I wanted to respond to your question about...
I saw Tamanisha hand, and I'll come to you after Cira. Okay? I'll come to you after Cira. Thank you. Yes,
Yes,
Tom.
and I wanted to talk about sort of how do we then combat imperialism. And I think one of the first steps is to not repeat imperialist propaganda. When Shahzad was speaking, I was shocked that they would mention that 35,000 Iranians, according to who, Starlink was down, the internet was down, so no one knows, were dead. So what is the proof that 35,000 people died, first of all, especially because as we are in a live stream genocide going on 2 years of dead Palestinians where people didn't even want to admit that more than 30 to 40,000 had died over the span of 2 years, even though we witnessed live stream that massive destruction is ridiculous. I think that we need to be honest on the left about what imperialism means. And it means that you are attracting a surplus from the regions and countries that you are exploiting. So even when we talk vaguely about superpowers, no one ever mentions the fact that China does not receive a surplus from the peripheral countries that it is exploiting. So when we are talking about global imperialism, we are still talking about the fact that the imperialist system is still dominated by Western financial capital, of which the US is at the forefront and which it leads. I think that ignoring the materialist conception of what imperialism and what sovereignty means leads to misguided calculations on combating what is actually imperialism, because now people are distracted on focusing on what these lesser powers are doing, which only serves to strengthen US and Western imperialism, not just in the Caribbean, but globally. As far as the sort of axis of resistance is concerned and why Iran is included in that, is that the axis of resistance is not talking about a liberal conception of just having solidarity with states. It's talking about real material and ideological help and aid extended to those people's forces and those states who stand against US hegemony and impositions onto other states. And so again, you have to have precise and accurate definitions of things like imperialism, like the axis of resistance, and also a materialist conception of sovereignty. Otherwise, you will be in support of reactionary projects. Without a materialist conception of sovereignty, we sort of justified then Taiwan as a Western military outpost situated to attack China because the US sees it as a competitor. We sort of enshrine the existence of something like Somaliland in Somalia. We sort of enshrine the existence of a settler colonial state like Israel on Palestine, when we ignore that sovereignty also has a materialist conception, and that materialist conception matters because those sovereignties that are under attack are those sovereignties where people and community power is elevated over that of an oppressive straight state structure subordinated to Western imperialism in the global capitalist system. And so my thing for combating imperialism would first be to define imperialism, to not spread imperialist propaganda without proof. When you want to critique left terms or left understanding of terms like something like axis of resistance, to actually know what you're talking about so that you're not having a sort of opportunistic association with this vague concept of the left and calling yourself an anti-imperialist or an anti-capitalist or even a communist. And so there's some things that I heard that I was just like, what is going on? And so I felt that I needed to say that so that if anyone is watching, they know 100% where I stand.
I'm so glad that Tamanisha spoke before me because she said it so much better than I could. But I have the very same concern. Basically, to respond to the question as to how to build an anti-imperialist world, a world for collective emancipation based on sovereignty, on the sovereignties of peoples, the first thing that we have to do is define correctly what is imperialism. We have never been bombed by China. In Latin America and the Caribbean, in the continent of Africa, that hasn't happened. Although there has been some participation in some irregular wars of Russian forces, but who has bombed, has been and depleted and colonialized and exfoliated the continent of Africa has been the US, and of course before that, Europe. And we could go around the world, and I think the answer would be practically the same, with a few very tiny exceptions. We could go into, I don't know, we could have a long debate about Russia and its periphery, and how Russia had to, from my perspective, in terms of generating a situation of control because NATO was encroaching it, it had to indeed invade a country. And there's a whole debate to be made there, but those are totally and absolutely different situations as the ones that those of us in the global south have lived in terms of US imperialism and have never lived because of China or because of Russia. With Iran, the numbers are absurd. I mean, the numbers are so absurd, but what we can actually see, and it was actually live streamed, was the millions of people that poured into the streets of Tehran and around Iran in support of the government and in rejection of what happened. And what we heard from the Mossad and we heard from Netanyahu is that they directly participated. It wasn't just tweets. They actually said it. And who were the people who died most in Iran? Police services at the service of the so-called regime. And who was prepared militarily to kill them? Well, paramilitary forces that were actually armed by Israel. And this should be no surprise to anybody, because indeed they are part of the edge of resistance. And we hope to also be part of the edge of the axis of resistance. I mean, in Venezuela, we are far away and we have US imperialism right here, but we also want to be part of an axis of resistance that stands tall to US imperialism. And that's what we see in Iran, which has been so, I mean, if there has been one country that has had the commitment and the capacity to help the people of Palestine and has actually done it, it is Iran. And of course, Hezbollah and the Houthis, and there have been many people who have been really putting their bodies and their lives in the defense of the people of Palestine against the genocide in Gaza. So it almost makes me tremble to hear this narrative that actually does reproduce what the US says. I mean, the only difference is in terms of this narrative that I have heard is that actually maybe I kind of heard that sanctions were bad, but I'm not even sure that I heard it, that they might have an implication that US imperialism may have some sort of, by going against a so-called authoritarian regime, maybe reinforcing it, which is absolutely absurd. I mean, the sanctions on Venezuela have not helped the government. They've not helped the people. They've hurt everybody. And I'm sure that I can say this for Venezuela, I'm 100, and I know I can say this for Cuba, and I'm 100% sure I can say the same thing for Iran. So if we are with the people of Iran, there's only one line that we can follow, and that's to be against US imperialism. Let the people of Iran solve their own problems. I'm sure there are problems in Iran. There are problems in Venezuela too that we have to solve. But do not reproduce a discourse that is so absurd, talking about, I don't know what numbers of people dead in very few days and no images whatsoever. And you can talk about an internet blackout, but I mean, as far as I know, people still have their phones and they could have taken a picture. And now we could be, if tens of thousands of people had been killed, we would be seeing pictures now, now that there's no internet.
I think, Cira, you have gone, I can't take it anymore because it is disgusting.
Well, I mean, it is very offensive for me too, what I heard.
It is disgusting that you are insulting millions and millions of people.
He's insulting imperialist propaganda, not Iranians. What is insulting is that you're on this panel spreading imperialist propaganda. You should link
stop talking
for your
over
numbers.
me. Please stop talking over me, because both of you.
Hello,
no, you started. Wait a second, because I was talking.
I'm asking people to stop.
I was talking.
I'm asking people to stop. Cilla, asking everybody to stop right now, and I'm going to just give me a minute here. I'm going to be blunt and say that I'm having some concerns with both the kind of assumptions that are being made, and Tamashita and Cira, I both respect your positions and your politics. I mean, I'm a communist, right? So I both respect, but I have a problem when people, you know, who are on the ground and who have been on the ground and who have been doing this work on the ground and say, look, 35,000 people have been killed. I mean, it's happened in Palestine when I remember when people were saying thousands and thousands of Palestinians were dying and everybody was denying it, saying, well, we didn't see it. We haven't seen it. We don't know. We don't know if this is happening. So I think we need to be really careful about how we are shutting down people here on this panel. We get to echo our positions, but we also get to respect where people are coming from in terms of their part of the world and the struggles that they have been engaged with. And you know, I don't agree, and I'll be blunt, I do not agree that Shahzad is pro-imperialist. I disagree with you. I do not agree with that, and I will stand on that. Shahzad is an anti-imperialist, but we have to understand we're speaking about Iran, and we are speaking about a particular part of the world that many of us, our historical experiences and the kind of work that we have done. I've been involved in the Grenada Revolution. So we came from a particular kind of historical referent of Western imperialism, of US imperialism, whereas in the Middle East, there are multi-forces. So I just want us to be really careful about how we engage this conversation. It's a tough one. I took an opportunity to kind of bring all of these pieces together. Clearly, it was a hard one, but I'm hoping that we can finish this with some, with respecting each other, even if we have hard disagreements, but respecting our comrades, because we're all comrades here. We're all left comrades here. Let's be really clear. We're all left comrades here. So let's step back a bit and respect where each other is coming from. And I'm going to give Shahzad an opportunity to speak now because everyone has listened. And David, I'll come back to you. Is that okay?
I was interrupted. I want everybody to know that I was interrupted. So about the numbers, I absolutely have not seen any actual other than Western information about them. And we have seen no images. And we saw images of the genocide. We saw them. So when people deny the tens of thousands of people being killed in Gaza, we were seeing it. We are not seeing that in relation to Iran. And now there's no internet blockade. And we are still not seeing the images.
Okay, thanks, Cira. But one of the things that we have learned is that the fact that you're not seeing something doesn't mean it's happening. It's not happening. So let's be very careful with that. That's a big lesson we all learned already. So let's be careful. Shahzad, could you go ahead, please?
I will be very brief because the information is there. And I'm not going to talk about where to go about it. It seems that they haven't even taken the care of looking at what is available and what kind of information is coming out of human rights group. I spend most of my day today in helping some trusted doctors in different parts in the Kurdish region of Iran and also in Tehran, in order for the wounded people to be taken to the hospital to trusted doctors, because not all doctors can be trusted, and they will report the wounded ones to the authorities. And human rights group that the Commission on Human Rights that have received the report from Iran are saying that this number is really underestimated, and the numbers of the dead is growing up. But I think that that's not the main issue here. It's the issue is not, it seems that they even haven't had the courtesy of listening to me, and therefore mischaracterizing my sort of position on capitalist imperialism by arguing the only thing is that it's the notion of this deadly notion of axis of resistance and putting the Islamic regime as part of this axis, and not understanding that this is the regime that is basically this axis of resistance is working on this deadly poisonous sort of understanding of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and that is how it is working on. Islamic regime is a deadly theocratic authoritarian regime that really is not supporting the cause and the genocide of Palestinian and people. And there are many on the Palestinian side that will argue that the support of the Islamic regime has not been a support for Palestinian cause and Palestinian struggles. Neither it has been for the cause and the struggle of Iranian people. We need to understand that these type of the coalition and the dictatorial coming together of these powers are not addressing the question that we want to address, which is how to fight, organize, and build solidarity around the justice struggle of the people on the ground. That is what we need to do, and I'm really disappointed and amazed that how much the colleagues are capable of not hearing and not listening, and then only attacking based on their own political sort of a stance and ideological position. I consider myself an anti-imperialist. I consider myself a not only anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, imperialist, and I do not see anything within this the authoritarian regime of Iran and then some of the other authoritarian regimes in the region that will give me any sort of signs of being anti-imperialist. They are capitalist, imperialist, as much as anywhere else. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shahzad. David, I want to give you
Yes,
some time to
yes,
speak, as you've been
yes,
very
please.
quiet. So please go ahead.
I've been listening.
Right.
So there's one thing that was said by you, Beverly, and by Shahzad, which is true, and that the world is complex. All right. But I also believe that we have to be very clear, both historically and in terms of an understanding of our concrete reality. So let me go back to 1979, because Shahzad spoke about 1979. And it is very true that the overthrow of the Shah, who was, let us be very clear, an instrument of US imperialism, was repressive and so on, and facilitated, of course, the exploitation of Iran's oil by multinational capital. So that overthrow was something that was on the ground. In fact, my memory says, because of course I was a member leader of the Oil Workers Trade Union, that it began with a strike by all workers around specific industrial issues. But it very rapidly moved from that to becoming a much wider movement. And Shahzad is right. So it was not just those who had a theocratic position, but it was there were left organizations and political parties and so on. There were trade unions. All of that was part of a mass movement. But I don't have all the information, and nor do we have time to interrogate all of that. No, eventually it led to the establishment of a theocratic state. Okay, now we can all analyze and speak about theocratic states and the extent to which those states represent the best or forward motion for the development of societies and the building of just societies, and so on. And I don't know that we need to engage in that particular discussion now. But it is an issue that clearly has to be addressed. The concern I have, though, is when we start to equivocate a theocratic state, which has its own internal contradictions. Patriarchy is clearly one, and so on, and a dogmatic interpretation of Islam in a way that is not in keeping with equality of women, of how of many other things, and so on. That's an internal contradiction within the state of Iran. But I don't know that you could then equate that somehow with a link to imperialism, as the Iranian state somehow is linked to imperialism. That is a bridge way too far to cross. The reality is, and let us be real, why is Iran the target of both the US and Israel, the Zionist state of Israel? Why is Iran the target? Because however authoritarian you want to say Iran is, so is Saudi Arabia. So are many of the Emirates. Those are not democracies in even the normal liberal Western democracy that the US and Europe touts as being of their values. They're not, okay? And the rights of people are suppressed, women's rights are suppressed, and so on in those societies. There's extreme exploitation of migrant labor in those countries. So why are they not the target of sanctions by the US? Why are they not the target of Israel in terms of attacking and so on? And it's very clear that Iran is, because Iran does pose a threat to Israel, and Israel, as we all know, is the main instrument of US imperialism in that part of the world, which is called the Middle East. And we cannot deny that, and we could see what Israel has been doing in terms of attacking not only the genocide of Palestinians, but attacks on Syria and Lebanon and so on, and essentially seeking now to establish a Zionist state in all of those countries. Israel really wants to control all of those countries, and that's part of the imperialist and US imperialist and Zionist agenda. So we have to be clear about that. And therefore, in that context, we cannot then, it is a false equivalence of suggesting that somehow Iran is then part of an imperialist agenda. I also agree with both Tamanisha and Cira with respect to the analysis of China. China, it does not engage in extractivism. China has not sought to militarily control or colonize any state, and so on. And it has provided huge amounts of resources to build infrastructure and other projects in the global south, and is key in terms of the development of the BRICS as a response to US imperialism and US global hegemony. So, we could discuss again, and no country is perfect. So we could discuss the internal contradictions in China, but to then bring that into a discussion as if countries somehow are now being dominated by China, and therefore we are subjecting ourselves to new forms of colonialism or imperialism, I think that is wrong. I think that is wrong. And I agree, Tamanisha, in that regard. It feeds into the US narrative. The US was going around the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world pushing this idea that any agreements with trade and Belt and Road and somehow those things are going to result in a colonization through huge debt to China, and countries will become so indebted that they become beholden to China and a whole range of stuff like that. That was the US narrative in an attempt to counter China's rise and the US own decline, both in terms of its economic capacity, its technological capacity, and its hegemony. And so we have to be very clear and identify, as we used to do, what is the principal enemy that we are dealing with? What is the principal contradiction? And the principal contradiction is US imperialism, particularly now in this era of extremely aggressive imperialism by the United States. We can't ignore that. And let me just say, Beverly, that I disagree with you on one thing. The US invasion did not destroy the Grenadian Revolution. It was destroyed internally as a result of Bernard Cord, Hudson Austin, who regretted it afterwards, as he has said in interviews and so on prior to his death. And I know all of them. I knew all of them.
I agree with you that it was
okay, good.
Destroyed
all right.
internally.
But US imperialism jumped. Hold a second.
Yeah. In Grenada for a long, like prior to that, they were
of course.
But they were,
of course they were. And I suppose at some point in time, we'll find out who the CIA turned within that group.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
But it was dogmatism. It was dogmatism by Cord and so on, fed by Trevor Monroe.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
Okay, so but U.S. imperialism jumped on it, and you're right, because Eugenia Childs, Tom Adams, Eddie Seago, and so on supported U.S. imperialism because they clearly were opposed to what Grenada represented. So I want to come back to how do we build the struggle against imperialism? How do we build anti-imperialist front? It has to begin with political education, because those of us who live in our part of the world, of course, consume primarily the narratives that come out of the United States. You turn on your television, and what you get are television channels out of the US, and so on, even telling us what the weather is like in this city and that city, and so on. And our education system, unfortunately, does not sufficiently ground us in our own history and sense of identity and a knowledge of the resistance and struggles, beginning with the First Peoples and then the enslaved Africans, and through indentureship and whatever else, and up to freedom. So we don't know our own heroes and heroines who have fought against colonialism, who fought anti-imperialist struggles, and what those have meant, and that the gains that we have won, even though there may be gains of social democracy and of liberal Western democracy, which is capitalist democracy, even those gains were really fought for and won by the working class on their own, wasn't led or fought by anybody else. So we need to engage in major political education, and the challenges of that now will be, how do we do that in the context of social media, where young people don't look at anything beyond 35 seconds or a minute and so on. So those are some of the challenges that the left face. And then secondly, how do we build not just mobilizations, because the mobilizations can happen around the attack against Venezuela, or the solidarity with the people of Palestine and the genocide by Israel. So solidarity and mobilization could take place around those things. But how do we turn that mobilization into strong organizations? Because the reality is that, well, I'm not speaking about Latin America, I'm speaking about English-speaking Caribbean, that the left became very weak, and in some cases non-existent, specifically after the assassination of Walter Rodney in Guyana in 1980, and then further as a result of the end of the Grenada Revolution in 1983. So how do we build organization? It begins with political education and mobilization, and then organization. And that is what we have to do. And that has to be done not simply about the international struggles. That has to be done about how do we transform our own societies, our own countries, in the way that Venezuela has been doing, the way that Cuba has been doing, but of course not modeled on them, but based upon our own concrete realities? How do we begin to transform, struggle to bring about fundamental change within our own countries? Because that is essential to building a broader international anti-imperialist struggle. So those are the things I wanted to add to the conversation.
Okay. I have a question that someone has given us. But before I get to that, I mean, I think one of the things, though, that I'm also hearing is when we're talking about building, or creating an anti-imperialist world, that there isn't a linear understanding of what that is, or a linear frame for what that is, because the world isn't linear, right? And there are different features that also shape us internationally and globally. So that even talking about how we create an anti-imperialist world, we also have to think about the context, the varying contexts in which people live, and what features and facets and powers that align, that needs to be needs to be confronted, right? So I'm just the question that came for all of you is the US the only imperialist power? How about all of the middle and little imperialistic powers like Canada, Turkey, and Iran? Yes, maybe the definition imperialism needs to be revised. Do people agree? Do people want to respond to that? And this is a question that came from one of the followers.
Since I
I'll take
spoke first, I will also say that's why I prefer to use the term US Western-led imperialism. While the US is the dominant person in the sort of global capitalist imperialist system, it's US Western-led imperialism because they are leading these other states that also extract surplus, and a lot of those are the old colonial powers.
Okay. Thanks, Tamanisha. Cira?
I agree. Basically, it's not just the US, but the US is the main player in this. And historical, if we go back to Europe or Canada, historically colonialist countries are part of the US-led imperialist bloc, and its best expression is actually NATO. And the other, there is a very clear thing that we can see is who is bombing people. And of course, we don't see Iran bombing other countries. We don't see China bombing other countries. So I think it's rather simple. The main, as David was saying, the main player in this is the US. It is the US hegemonic force. The US is the hegemonic force driving this whole thing. It is in a process of decay. That does not make it any less violent. It actually makes it more violent. And the most tangible expression of US imperialism right now, as we speak, is its counterpart, Israel, and the genocide on Palestine. But of course, it's not just the people of Palestine who are suffering, who are being bombed, but it's people around the whole world who are being bombed and under tremendous pressures, including unilateral coercive sanctions, which actually do kill tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, 500,000 people every year. And it is the US that is leading this sanctions regime around the world.
Thank you, Cira. Shahzad?
Thank you, David, for sort of outlining the kind of hard work that it is ahead of us, including political education, including going back to the historical knowledge, and also coming together in order to be able to mobilize around these issues. I think these are very, very important. I think that the specificity of the historical moment and a history is very important. I think that it seems that we all agree that post-World War II, the emergence of the US imperialism as the force in the world is now, we know that the consequences of all of that. But what we have today is also the end of the, since the end of the Cold War, the rivalry of three forces, three imperialist forces that in terms of creating a sphere of influences in the Middle East and in the rest of the world in terms of competing for resources, competing for a hegemony. And this is what we are facing today. U.S. imperialism is under its specific moment, which is a fascist government. It's a fascist, capitalist, imperialist. In the Middle East, its military force is the state of Israel. That is what they are doing. And this is what is happening and why the people in the Middle East are suffering from the deadly combination of all these forces. Who is letting it? It's undoubtedly, it is the US that has the power, economic power, political power, and the military power within the Middle East. Is definitely Israel is the key in order to do that. I think that this is the way that we need to sort of understand and forge some kind of a knowledge and alliance that we need in order to address all these issues. Thank you, Beverly.
Well, we've come to the end. Thank you. This has been pretty intense, exciting. I also feel like this kind of conversation is necessary, hard, difficult, where we actually create space to actually truly engage. We are living in very difficult times. We are living in very violent times. We are living in times where we are bombarded constantly with the everyday violence of state, of Western imperialism, of the powers, the kind of what we're witnessing in terms of the treacherous kind of violent powers of the Iranian state against the people. We are living in these very difficult times that we are now. We are seeing massive deaths in Somalia. We are seeing massive deaths in Congo, all funneled and fueled by the UAE. We are seeing, the way that states are coalescing, so that they can be power blocks. We are seeing that both West and East, right? So I think we need to I think the focus should be on how we think through building new worlds, how we think through building new worlds so that people can live, how we think through building new worlds that are just, right, that are liberated, right? I think that is the challenge for us right now, because what we are witnessing is that people are being repressed and suppressed. I mean, I am particularly concerned for what is happening in the Caribbean as someone from the Caribbean in terms of, I think there will be an increase in extrajudicial killings in Trinidad and Tobago and other countries because it has already begun. These are the things I think we need to also be focused on in terms of the fact that we also witnessing where the US are going to be sending, where Caribbean countries have agreed to take, deportees, how we are forced to cooperate with these particular decision-making by the US, and if not, the kind of threat we are under, right? We are witnessing all of this, how states are being suppressed and repressed, but how internally the leaders are also participating and cooperating with US imperialism. So I think I just want to leave us with that. And I want to thank you all for engaging and for being here and for agreeing to do this. And I know it was a difficult panel. And to apologize to all of you who felt that this didn't, that somehow, you know, you may not have been heard or not heard, or felt that somehow you didn't feel that this panel spoke to the kind of engagement that you had hoped it would. I felt it did. I felt it was important for us to have this conversation. And I thank you all very much. Shahzad, David, Cira, Tamanisha, for giving us your time and for giving us, for being here, on Scholar Strike Liberation Panel. I want to thank the people who followed us, who were listening. I want to thank those who actually helped put this panel together, the live streamer, Alexandra Jordan, Wad Judah, who is our social media specialist, and Hadley House, who is our creative producer, creative director, and who does all of our flyers and make things look good for us. So thank you very, very much, and I wish you all a good evening, and I hope to have more discussions in the future, and I hope you will. We will have an opportunity to chat again at some other time. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Tamanisha. Thank you very much, Cira. And thank you, Shahzad. Good night.
Okay, stream's ended.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
You want to stay on the line a bit?